Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, in the name of God, most compassionate, most merciful. It is truly an honor for me to come home again. While I've never lived in Sacramento, my last visit here to the SALAM Center was probably close to a decade ago. And I remember upon that visit, some of you I see shaking your head, nodding your heads, you perhaps remember me from way back then. When I think about the experience I had coming to visit the SALAM Center nearly a decade ago, I remember the feelings of warmness and of pride that I felt, and seeing another community, another mosque that modeled inclusion, pluralism, diversity, and embraced women as equal members of the community. And I continue to see that happen. So I've been watching your community from afar. And as I travel around the country and people ask me, well, tell me some mosques that get it. Tell me some mosques that are modeling the kind of American mosque that meets the needs of our American Muslim communities. The SALAM Center is always on my short list of mosques that are a model to the rest of our communities and to other faith communities in our country as well. Absolutely. I first congratulate the SALAM Center for its almost 30 years of setting a model in community development and education, in gender equity, in youth empowerment, and in interfaith engagement. These are truly the pillars that hold our communities together and that also connect our community with other faith communities and with broader society. So it is upon these pillars that this SALAM Center means so much, I'm sure, to each of you and to the surrounding communities. In this day and age, our mosques play an increasingly critical and vital role that is always expanding in the role of the health and the contribution of each and every one of us as American Muslims. And it also helps to facilitate our relationships with the broader society around us. The SALAM Center is a leader and a model in this regard. In this particular moment in our community and in our country, when politics have gotten more ugly and more divisive than ever, at least in recent memory, we must stand up and claim our voices. We must stand up and realize that not only are our voices needed, but that each one of us, no matter how soft our voices are, no matter if our voices shake, no matter if we're not sure that we're the right person for the job, that each one of us must exercise our voices in order to not just to represent Islam globally, but to represent the Islam that is in each one of our hearts. The biggest story that we can tell that impacts people around us is our story of faith. I was in an advanced communications training in DC just last week, actually at the beginning of this week. And one of the things that communications professionals who have tested messages related to the American Muslim community have found is that when American Muslims speak, that we tend to find more connection with other people when we talk about faith than when we talk about diversity and inclusion and tolerance. That where we have the ability to connect is in stories of faith, in our faith journey. That Islam is our path to God and other people can connect to a path to something spiritual, something bigger than them. And that creates a point of connection. That to me is some of the greatest news I've heard in a long time. Because it says that each one of us is an expert. Each one of us is an expert in our faith journey. And that it is far more important that we're comfortable to share our personal journey in faith than it is for us to share the 5 pillars of Islam, or to answer questions about Sharia, or you name it, all the issues that are out there. That it is far more powerful for us to tell a story about why we are Muslim, why I am Muslim, why I feel a connection to this faith, to our scripture, the Quran, and that everything else comes second. That says to me that we have great opportunities. And that's something that Allah tells us over and over again in the Quran. It's true that in times like this, it's very easy to focus on crises. It's very easy for us to fall into a crisis mentality, to wait for the next crisis to come along. Now, I have a professional Muslim job. Sometimes I feel like a professional Muslim. I like to believe that I'm also an unprofessional, more than that. But it is in it, and so I wake up and I'm checking for the crisis on my phone each and every morning. I can't lie about that. But the truth is that what I have learned, most of my professional life, I should say, has been since 9/11. While I graduated college back in '99. The bulk of my career has been in the post-9/11 arena. And in the course of this time, I have personally faced many emotional and spiritual setbacks. And it's taken me a long time to admit that. But because I know that the story of faith is the place of connection, I feel safe sharing that with each one of you. It's in these crises that I have felt crises in my own faith. Not in my faith in Allah, but in my faith in myself, to be able to rise to the challenge and know that Allah is on my side, and to know that I have not just a responsibility, but an opportunity in the face of crisis. And so in my home, my husband and I first jokingly created a new word to encompass the way that we feel in these moments, and it has become a word that we actually use in seriousness now. And that word is Chrisertunity. Because with each crisis, there is an opportunity. If you had asked me the morning of 9/11, after those towers fell down, when I found myself sitting in a church, holding my head, wondering what would become of my life, because I was already at an interfaith vigil that morning, not knowing who the perpetrators were, we already ran out to do that work. If you had told me then that we as a community would have our first 2 Muslim members of Congress within years after 9/11, that we would be building more mosques than ever, but that those mosques would not just be serving, as my old mentor, Dr. Maher Hattout, used to say, as places that helped us in our homesickness, but that instead were places that helped us to develop home, and that become home, as somebody just mentioned. If you had told me that we would have more Muslims than ever working in Hollywood, working in mainstream media, using platforms to be able to tell their own stories, and that we would be embraced by a presidential campaign, I would have just laughed. I certainly would, at the very least, to be polite in this setting. Because it's true that all I could see at the time was the potential for hate crimes, the potential for hate speech, the potential for our communities to feel marginalized, otherized, and un-American. But the Chrisertunity of 9/11 and the Chrisertunity of so many tragic events since then that have impacted our communities and other communities as well has shown us that some of the greatest growth can happen in moments of crisis. Some of the worst breakdowns can lead to some of the greatest breakthroughs. And that is what we have seen time and again in it's almost 15 years now since that awful day. So sure, today we're all seeing immense amounts of hate speech and incitement by politicians. We're seeing hate crimes and hate incidents targeting American Muslims and those who are perceived to be Muslim. It's true that we're seeing all of those things. And yet, when we go back to the Quran, we have a very clear prescription from Allah, from God, about how it is that we are supposed to respond to moments like these. What does Allah tell us about how we should respond to ridicule? He tells us, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, and the servants of the Most Merciful are those who walk gently upon the earth, and when the ignorant address them harshly, they say only peace. Allah gives us a clear prescription about how to deal with ridicule. How does Allah tell us to deal with hate? With outright hate. We think today, oh poor us, there's so much hate towards Muslims. We need only think back to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace be upon him, to know that he and the early companions, the early believers in Islam faced the worst kinds of persecution that we can't even imagine. And they had no ability to even defend themselves. Did you know that the verses that even allowed for self-defense were not revealed until they entered Medina? They had no ability to even defend themselves, to fight back. That instead Allah told them, when you face these things, just respond with peace. Walk gently upon the earth. And there was no greater example of that than Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, himself. In responding to hate, Allah tells us, "O you who believe, stand firm for God as witnesses to justice, and do not let the hatred of a people prevent you from being just. Be just. That is nearer to righteousness, and fear God, for God is acquainted with all that you do." Allah tells us very clearly here how we should deal with hate and injustice. That we cannot allow hate to allow us to swerve from the straight path. That hate cannot beget hate. And finally, what does Allah tell us about how to respond to evil? There's ridicule, there's hate, and then there's evil. And we all might define evil in different ways, but Allah tells us very clearly how we shall respond to evil. He tells us good and evil are not equal, so repel evil with what is better, so that the one who is like your worst enemy might become like your closest friend. Brothers and sisters, our charge is very clear, and the standard is very high. Allah expects of us to bring our best selves into each moment. And the bigger the crisis, the bigger the expectation that Allah sets out for us. That it's not enough in the face of evil to just say peace. It's not enough in the face of evil to not just be driven into hatred. But in the face of evil, we are charged to act by responding to evil with what is better. And setting our intention so that we believe that by responding to what is evil with what is better, that we can make our enemies like our closest friends. And we see that over and over again. So these are mandates for us as individuals. There are also descriptions of what we shall do as a community. And the SALAM Center, I believe, is leading the cause when it comes to these things. Each of us has a personal responsibility, but having a home like the SALAM Center, inshallah, gives each and every one of you a mosque home that supports your individual intentions, your individual work, your individual contributions to your families, to your neighborhoods, and to the broader Sacramento community around you. There is great news about the power of mosques in this country. Don't believe what they say about mosques, hiding radicals, being places where people can get radicalized. It's not just by stories that we can refute these lies. We know now through data that mosques are centers of individual and collective healing and growth. We know from a recent study, a recent poll that was just released by the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, ISPU. It's a Muslim think research tank that you might consider. We know from a recent poll they did just earlier this year and just released a few weeks ago that Muslims who say that their faith is important to their identity are more likely to say that being American is important to how they think of themselves than it is for those who expressed a weak religious identity. Did you get that? So people who express a stronger Muslim identity also tend to express a stronger American identity. That is a huge plus. That's a sign of what our mosques are able to accomplish by investing in people and investing in our spiritual growth. That it gives us hope, it gives us purpose, it gives us a sense of contribution in the society around us. That same survey found that those people who attend a mosque on a regular basis, which I believe they called weekly for Jummah prayers, were more likely to work with their neighbors to solve community problems, be registered to vote, and were more likely to plan to vote. So mosque attendance is associated with things that are contributing to society around us. Greater participation, greater involvement, greater contribution. Now, I also want to point out, and we're going to come back to this a little bit later, that while it's true that going to a mosque makes you more likely to be registered to vote and to say that you are planning to vote, we still have a long way to go when it comes to voting and using our political voice as a community and as individuals. So tonight, as we think about the role of the mosque and we ask ourselves, how can we thrive in times of crisis? How can we embrace the crisis opportunities that are around us on such a regular basis? I present to you a few different ways of thinking about what you can do, what all of us can do together. What can we do individually to embrace the Christ opportunities? First, I want to quote somebody who I hold in very high regard. His name is Ambassador Ibrahim Rasool. He was, until recently, South Africa's ambassador to the United States. He was active in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, along with a host of other Muslims. He was jailed, and he later rose in the Mandela government and became a governor of one of the provinces in South Africa and continued to serve his country, again, until recently, where he was the South African ambassador to the US. I heard a talk he did about a month ago at an ISNA conference in Chicago, where I was. And the simple sentence that was the thesis of his talk has stuck with me ever since. And that is that each one of us, as a result or as a reflection of our reading of the Quran, must embrace resilience and must exude compassion. Embrace resilience, exude compassion. This is a formula to keep us going. It's a mantra that can help us to remember what our purpose is and to remember our strength, particularly in moments of crisis, in moments where we feel down. He described those people as being the companions of the right hand. And I don't know if he pulled that from a hadith. My notes weren't good enough to clarify. But it's something that stuck with me. And it also, again, is in line with something that ISPU found in their recent poll, which is that those who reported being discriminated against that more than half of American Muslims reported being discriminated against in the last year, personally, far higher than any other faith group. And they did do this poll of many different faith groups. But that of those who did report that they had been discriminated against, that their response was that they were more likely to engage in community and civic activities. Rather than withdraw, rather than put themselves on the margin, rather than say, what's the point? They're just going to hate me anyway. That American Muslims who said that they actually experienced discrimination were more likely to roll up their sleeves and get more involved. And I think that that's a positive sign of our faith. It's a positive sign of what's powerful and what's possible when we utilize our faith to confront difficult times. It also mirrors something that Allah tells us in the Quran. I'm not a native Arabic speaker. You might guess that already. But this is one of a handful of verses that I have memorized in Arabic. And so I will share my bad Arabic with you. And I hope you forgive me. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم انفروا خفافا وثقالا وجاهدوا بأموالكم وأنفسكم في سبيل الله ذلكم خير لكم إن كنتم تعلمون, which means go forth whether you're equipped lightly or heavily and strive with your wealth and your lives in the cause of God. That is best for you if you but knew. Allah tells us very clearly there's no excuse. I hear people tell me all the time, well, I don't have a PhD in Islamic studies. I have an accent. I have, or I don't have the things that I need in order to talk about my faith, in order to be comfortable engaging with my neighbors on my street. And the truth is that each one of us has enough. Allah has given us enough. And that we do not need to rely on our Islamic knowledge so much as we need to rely on our Islamic hearts. The hearts that are open. Thank you. The hearts that are open. Because ultimately, it's when we connect from our hearts to our neighbors' hearts that real change happens. And the fact that this room was packed with your Sacramento neighbors, ready to stand up and be united we stand, says a lot about the interest of people to gather with us and stand alongside people who are marginalized. We focus so much on the discrimination, the hate crimes, the hate incidents, and they are real, brothers and sisters. But in every mosque that I have had a relationship with in this country, and every mosque that I checked in with after San Bernardino and after Paris and after Brussels, they reported over and over again that the outpouring of love and support that they received outshadowed, outmeasured the hate and the discrimination by 10 to 1 at least. That there was far more love that they received from neighbors than hate and animosity. And my sense is that that was the case here too at the SALAM Center. So there are plenty of good hearts left, and we should focus on them. So that's the first thing. Embrace resilience, exude compassion. And know that that is the way that we can strive with whatever we have. We can strive in the cause of God, and that is a benefit for us, not just for those who we engage with. The second point I want to share is a quote from an American author named Alice Walker. Some of you may have heard of The Color Purple, the book. Some of you may have read it. It's one of my favorites. I was an English major, so I can't help it. But one of the things that she said, not in that book, but in other writings, is that the most common way people give up their power is by thinking they don't have any. That, when I read it, it spoke to me. I instantly felt a zing in my heart, because that's what I see in our communities every single day, is that when we feel we are marginalized, then we're marginalized. When we feel we have a voice, we have a voice. Nobody can take away from you what you know you have. And that's what we need to lean into, because each of us has a zone of influence. Not all of us, nor any of us, can get President Obama on the phone, or Donald Trump, or any of the other wild characters that are out there right now. But each of us does have a zone of influence in our immediate lives. And in moments like these, in between crises, these are moments to double down in our connections with our friends, our colleagues, our neighbors, people who are of different faiths and different backgrounds than we are. Because turbulent times like these should inspire us to step up rather than to step back. It is in turbulence that the kind word that we share, the gentle walking upon the earth, the contributions that we make the biggest difference. Because it allows our neighbors, our coworkers, our children's teachers to be able to see not ISIS when they think of Islam, but Fatima, or Ahmed, or Muhammad, or Anne, or Edina, right? And to know that we are all Muslim, and that we are the face of Islam. We have the opportunity to present the face of Islam, not by talking about Muslims, what we Muslims believe, but that I and this community here in Sacramento believe. The community that I'm a part of does X, Y, and Z. And that's where we have our greatest impact. Now is the time to stay connected to all our friends, colleagues, and neighbors, and to share authentically and compassionately of ourselves. You are not a walking spokesperson for Islam. Handing out Qur'ans and reciting the 5 pillars of Islam is not the way to change hearts and minds, in my humble opinion. Instead, and what we know, again, from what works in messaging, I'm a communications person, what we know that works, again, is in sharing your story. Everywhere I go, when I'm in interfaith audiences, I always start with 5 minutes of sharing my story. I was born Muslim, but we were cultural Muslims. When I'm in Christian audiences, I say we were like Christmas and Easter Christians. Or in front of Jewish audiences, we were like high holidays Jews. We went to the major holidays, but for the most part, I didn't know anything about Islam growing up, even though I was born Muslim. My parents are from the former Yugoslavia. So where did I get my information from? Television screens and film screens, just like most of my audiences. By starting there, I start a place of commonality. I don't just understand and empathize. I was actually there. I get it. I don't blame you for thinking bad things when you rely on television screens and film screens. But I invite you to get to know me as a Muslim, as one example of a Muslim, and as a conduit to knowing other Muslims. You heard the statistic already that about 60% of Americans report that they do not know a Muslim firsthand. Now that might seem depressing, but I'll give you a different spin on it, if you will. When we think about the population of American Muslims, there are just over 3 million of us, if you believe the Pew Center on Religion, and I tend to. Just over 3 million of us. That means that we represent just 1% of the American population, which is about 330 plus million. If 40% of Americans report knowing 1% of Americans, that's not bad. I think we're starting, I think that it's a representation of how far we have been able to go in the face of crisis. That we have, whether we use the word crisis-opportunity or not, that we have used these crisis-opportunities to be able to get to know more people. And that social media is probably helping bridge the divide as well. But we have a strong foundation to build from. And why does it matter if somebody knows a Muslim? Well, it matters because it's the single greatest predictor of whether somebody has a positive or negative perception of Islam and Muslims. It's all rooted in whether they know a Muslim. So each of us has an immense amount of power if we claim it. Now, I said I was going to come back to voting. We give up a lot of power when we don't vote. Registering to vote and getting involved in this election is a must. It's not an optional, it's not an extracurricular, it is a must. There are lots of positive things to report about our growth as a community, but voting, we have a ways to go. We are still, among all faith groups, we have the lowest level of voter registration. American Protestants and Jews are registered at 91% of them are registered to vote by their own self-reported standards. Any guesses? What percent? No, I won't let you guess because it's going to be depressing. I'll just fill in. American Muslims, the rate of voter registration is 51%. That means just half of eligible American Muslim voters are actually registered to vote. I won't ask you to raise your hand if you're in that category, but I will urge you to know that there is power in voting. It doesn't change everything, but it does change something. And that democracy is decided by people who show up, who participate, who use their voices. In Los Angeles, the last mayoral election that was held, just less than 15% of Angelenos went to the polls to vote in the mayoral election. I hope it's higher here. It's a sad reality for Los Angeles. But that's a plus, it's a crisis-opportunity, if you will, because people who do show up have a disproportionate influence. In this day and age, we can have a disproportionate influence through our votes. So I saw that there's voter registration taking place outside. That is a step, that is absolutely a crucial step. I also mentioned to Sister Ann that potentially considering having the SALAM Center be a polling location how many of you, I vote in a church like on a regular basis. So have houses of worship are usually on the roster when it comes to polling places. What more American, what more Muslim thing to do than to open our doors and have this be a place where people use their voice to help their broader communities be better. Third, okay. The third and last thing that I want to stress is that in terms of what we can do individually, I urge you to lean in to the problem of Islamophobia. Many of us are leaning back because of Islamophobia. That because we fear that people hate us or we're afraid what they think about we think, about they think, about we think, that we just lean back. We button our lip. We let somebody else do it. In this day and age, with Islamophobia being steady, this is, again, good news, bad news, you decide. Islamophobia has stayed pretty steady since 9/11. We haven't had any more major breakdowns, but we have a great opportunity for a major breakthrough. And we should realize that not all Islamophobia was created equally. Islamophobia is a catch-all term that includes sentiment that can be rooted in ignorance, in fear, or in hate. It's not always all three in one person. And Islamophobia that's rooted in ignorance, Islamophobia that's rooted in fear is healable. Both of those are healable. The Islamophobia that's rooted in hate, that's being conducted by that cottage industry of anti-Muslim bigots that are out there, that's a different kind of battle. But when it comes to the Islamophobia, the everyday Islamophobia that's rooted in ignorance and hate, we have the power to deal with ignorance and fear by getting to know new people and tapping into the power of vulnerability, sharing our personal stories, our personal experience with faith, and building a connection that changes hearts and minds. We have that power. As Maya Angelou, another extraordinary American author, said, "I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel." I think the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, also embodied that characteristic, that he was able to speak to people in their own language. May we too find the space within ourselves to do that, to remember that it's about how people feel, not just what we do for them or what we say to them, but how we make them feel. The way that you heal any kind of Islamophobia is by exposing somebody to the thing that they're most afraid of, not by throwing a bucket of spiders at them or locking them into a small room for a year, right? If they have claustrophobia or arachnophobia, but instead by exposing them to the thing they're most afraid of in a controlled and safe environment, repeatedly and gradually with bigger exposure, so that they get calmer, they find connection, and they can build from there. You might have your own misgivings about the word Islamophobia, and I hear it all the time. But I actually feel pretty comfortable with it as a term, because I think that we are dealing with the phobia. It's an irrational fear. And the good news is that you can heal phobias. You can heal them, but it takes work. I wish I could ship a Muslim out to every home in America, because I think that our hospitality would convince enough people that we were people they would want to hold on to and celebrate. So I invite you to think about these 3 opportunities where you can do something to thrive in moments of crisis. That you claim your power, you claim your zone of influence by getting to know people, by registering to vote, by doing all those things where you can claim your voice. And secondly, by embracing resilience and exuding compassion. And thirdly, by leaning into the problem of Islamophobia, by sharing yourself, by being that thing that if somebody is exposed to in a safe and controlled environment over and over again, that you can be the healing agent that heals their Islamophobia. And it's beautiful to me that the verses that the reciter started with is the verse that I wanted to end on. Because one of the reasons that I'm Muslim is because I believe in God's light. I believe that God is the embodiment of light, of progress, of beauty. And that Allah tells us that He is light, He is the light of the heavens and the earth. He tells us in Surah An-Nur. And He says that He is light upon light, and that He guides to His light whom He wills, and He presents examples for the people, and that He is knowing of all things. May Allah guide us all as we strive in His cause. May He allow us to embrace our voices. May He allow us to embrace the power that we do have. And may He allow us to reflect His light in our homes, in our neighborhoods, and in the broader Sacramento community. I thank you so much for having me here tonight. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.